first sign was not silence, but sound. Rain on thatch, rain on shutters, rain slipping from the edge of a roof into a yard already churned to dark paste by boots, hooves, and wagon wheels. Somewhere beyond the house, a pig complained from a pen that smelled of wet straw and sour dung. A woman stood in a doorway with a wooden bowl pressed against her apron and looked up at a sky that had forgotten how to clear. The light was thin, almost metallic. Morning had arrived, but it did not feel new, it felt used already. In a village in northern Europe in the spring of 1315, that kind of morning did not yet look like history. It looked like inconvenience, a delay. One more day of damp wool, smoky rooms and muddy lanes. Bread ovens would still be lit. A child would still be sent to fetch water. A man would still go out to inspect a field, just as though the field now looked less like land than like something half returned to swamp. Life had always been vulnerable to weather, and medieval people knew that far better than we do. They did not need to be taught dependence. They lived inside it every day. But what began in those wet months was not just a bad season. It was the beginning of one of the worst famines medieval Europe would ever endure. A crisis that spread across much of northern Europe from 1315 to 1317, and in some places left scars for years after. To understand what survival meant during the Great Famine, you have to begin before the hunger sharpened. You have to begin when the cupboards were not full exactly, but normal. When most people were already living close to the edge in a way that would feel astonishing now. Europe had grown for generations. More land had been cleared, more mouths had been born, more villages had been pushed into soils and climates that were usable, though not generous. In better years, grain yields were modest by modern standards even on decent land, and in bad years they could sink to levels so low that one season's disappointment quietly ate into the next season's hope. By the early 14th century, there was less slack in the system than people realised while things were still functioning. A poor harvest did not simply mean less variety at table. It could mean the difference between planting again and not planting at all. Then the weather changed its mood and kept it. Modern climate reconstruction suggests that the growing seasons leading into the famine years, especially 1314 through 1316, were among the wettest in Europe across many centuries of record. Chroniclers did not use the language of hydroclimate variability, of course. They wrote like people trapped inside a punishment they could not interrupt. They described relentless rain, flooded ground, and summers too cold and waterlogged for grain to ripen properly. The trouble was not one dramatic storm that could be remembered by name. It was persistence, a sky that refused to close the wound, a season that failed to turn when it should have. The ordinary clock of rural life began to slip, and once the rhythm of the fields faltered, everything attached to the fields faltered with it. Grain was not just food, it was calculation. It was rent, obligation, ale, seed, fodder, wages, and winter itself. You needed dry stretches to plough properly, to sow, to cut, to stack, to store. You needed enough warmth for crops to ripen, enough sun for hay to cure, enough trust in the weather to bring in what the land had managed to produce before mould and rot claimed it. In the famine years, heavy rain and saturated soils made that whole sequence begin to fail. Grain spoiled or underperformed. Hay could not be dried properly. Straw was poor. Animals went short. Roads deteriorated. Carts bogged down. What looked from a distance like bad harvests felt, at ground level, like a chain of practical breakdowns, each one tightening the next. So imagine the household at the centre of this story not as a symbol, but as a room. It is low-ceilinged and dim, the air thick with peat smoke or wood smoke depending on the region, with damp garments hanging where they can. A pot sits near the fire, and whatever goes into it has become thinner than it was last year. The bread is darker, heavier, rougher, cut with cheaper grains if cheaper grains can still be found. The adults eat carefully and without announcing that they are doing so. Children notice portions before they understand prices. A loaf becomes smaller in a family memory before anyone says the word scarcity aloud. For the poor, hunger did not arrive as one clean dramatic moment. It crept in by subtraction. The bacon gone earlier in the year than it should have been. The cheese hoarded, the ale weaker, the pottage stretched with whatever could swell in water and still pretend to be a meal. Then the selling began. A cloak, a tool, a small reserve, something made by hand that should have lasted another season. Medieval families were used to improvisation. They knew how to endure lean weeks. But famine is what happens when every familiar method of endurance is tried by too many people at once, for too long, under skies that do not relent. Prices rose with a cruelty that was mathematical and intimate at the same time. Grain became dearer not in theory, but at the stall, in the sack, in the pause before purchase. In England, wheat prices shot upward with shocking speed during the opening phase of the crisis. Other foodstuffs followed. Salt, so necessary for preserving meat and fish, became harder to obtain and more expensive in the wet conditions, because even preservation depended on weather and transport. A wet world does not just reduce the harvest. It weakens the whole art of keeping food alive after harvest. That matters deeply in a society without refrigeration, without imported abundance, without any real escape from season. The people who suffered first were the people with the least reserve, but famine has a way of becoming visible only when it reaches upward. One of the starkest glimpses from 1315 comes from St Albans, where even King Edward II, passing with his household in August, struggled to obtain bread. That detail survives because it was extraordinary. Kings were not supposed to feel shortage in public. Their hunger, when it appeared at all, was usually hidden behind servants' storehouses' command. If the royal household could not easily find bread, the message was plain enough for anyone listening below the level of power. The ordinary market had become strained beyond its usual limits. Scarcity was no longer just peasant misfortune. It had become a condition in the air. Still, rank mattered. It mattered terribly. A lord might reduce his table but still eat. A monastery might tighten distributions yet survive on stores, rents and rights. A prosperous merchant might buy at prices that ruined others. But for labourers, small tenants, cotters, widows, servants, and the drifting poor of towns, the margin between living and collapsing was narrow even in decent years. Many households had little to fall back on beyond the next wage, the next patch of grain, the next favour from kin. In a bad year they might borrow. In a worse one they might pawn or sell. In a string of bad years they were forced into choices that damaged the future in order to remain alive in the present. That is one of the quiet brutalities of famine. It makes survival expensive in ways that continue long after the stomach is full again. And so survival became a series of bargains. Some families ate the grain that should have been saved for sowing. It was a desperate decision, but also a rational one if your children were hungry now, and the next harvest still existed only as prayer. Others slaughtered animals they ought to have preserved, including the very beasts that gave them traction, manure, milk, or future young. A horse, an ox, a breeding animal, a flock reduced too early. These were not merely assets. They were pieces of tomorrow, yet famine persuades people to break tomorrow open and consume it a little at a time. Beyond the village boundaries, woods and wastes took on a harsher importance. In better years, uncultivated land could supplement the household modestly. Fuel gathered, pigs turned out, berries or nuts collected in season. Grasses cut where rights allowed. In famine, those margins were searched with a new intensity. People dug for edible roots, gathered whatever wild matter they knew could be boiled, dried, pounded or mixed into food, and pressed harder on landscapes that had never been meant to feed everyone at once. Commons were not romantic places. They were negotiated spaces of need, rights, memory, argument, and necessity. In bad years, they became more precious and more contested. You can feel, in all this, the physical texture of the crisis. Wet feet that rarely dried, hands reddened by cold water and lye, the smell of spoiled grain when a bin was opened, the ache in the back from lifting sacks that seemed insultingly light for the labour they had required, the way a hungry body changes time, making evening come slowly and sleep come uneasily, the way a mother might listen to rain after dark not as weather anymore but as subtraction, another field worsening, another price rising, another journey to market that might end with less in the basket than dignity can bear. And yet famine did not erase routine all at once. That is part of what makes it haunting. Bells still rang, people still attended mass, rent was still owed, bread was still baked when there was flour enough, children still needed tending, animals still had to be mucked out, even when feeding them had become a source of anxiety. Medieval life was structured by obligations that did not disappear simply because suffering widened. In some ways, That structure helped people endure. Ritual can steady the mind when the body's afraid. In other ways, it deepened the cruelty. Hunger did not excuse you from the world. You still had to move through it. There was, too, the spiritual weight of the disaster. Medieval Europeans did not experience weather as morally empty. Many understood calamity through the language available to them: divine anger, chastisement, warning, trial. Processions were held, prayers were said. But prayer did not dry the fields. Faith could offer explanation, comfort, community, perhaps even the strength to wake and try again. It could not produce grain where grain had failed. That gap between devotion and material relief would matter deeply as the crisis lengthened, because people can bear hardship more easily than they can bear the feeling that the order of the world itself has ceased to answer. By the end of 1315, what had begun as bad weather had become a new way of thinking. Families counted differently. Lords worried differently. Town authorities watched markets differently. People no longer asked only whether the next loaf could be bought. They began asking what else could be sold, spared, watered down, bartered, hidden, borrowed, or eaten. Survival narrowed from season to season, meal to meal, choice to choice. And that is where the true story of the Great Famine begins, not with harvest totals or royal orders, but with the slow dismantling of ordinary life. With the moment a household starts consuming its seed, its animals, its tools, its pride, its certainty, with the knowledge that hunger is no longer passing through, but settling in. By the second year, the famine no longer felt like a misfortune that might lift with patience. It had settled into the bones of Europe. What made 1316 so frightening was not simply that people were already hungry. It was that they entered the new growing season weakened, indebted, and short of almost everything a farming society needed in order to recover. The grain that should have gone into the soil had often been eaten. The hay that should have carried animals through winter had been poor or spoiled. Families that might once have managed a bad year by borrowing, pawning, or tightening their belts had already done those things, and still the rain returned. Across much of northern Europe, another cold, wet season deepened the failure, turning an emergency into a condition of life. So if you stood in a field in the spring of 1316, you would not have seen only mud and seed. You would have seen fatigue, the slow, expensive kind, an ox not pulling as it should, a horse with its ribs too visible under a dull hide, a ploughman trying to guide a team through ground that clung to the blade and boots alike. The body remembers shortage even when the hands are still working. Medieval labour demanded calories before calories were a concept. It demanded breath, strength, muscle, warmth, and the confidence that tomorrow's work would not be for nothing. Famine steals all of that by degrees. This is why one of the cruelest survival choices of the Great Famine was the slaughter of valuable animals. Not only pigs and poultry, which might be turned into food relatively quickly, but sometimes the larger creatures that made the whole agricultural year possible. Draft animals were a household's force multiplied. They pulled ploughs, carts, harrows, and timber. They helped convert land into bread. To kill or sell them was like dismantling part of the farm itself. Yet when fodder failed and prices rose, keeping them alive could become impossible. Families and manors alike faced the same bleak arithmetic: feed the animal and starve the people, or consume the future in order to survive the present. Livestock disease made the calculation harsher still. Recent work using manorial evidence shows that the wet conditions of these years damaged animal health, as well as human harvests, increasing mortality among cattle and especially sheep. You can imagine the silence around such decisions. No grand speech, no dramatic gesture, only the practical movement of a life narrowing. A man running his hand over a beast he has raised from a calf. A child noticing that the shed is emptier. A woman calculating how many meals a slaughtered animal might provide once salting, drying, and spoilage have all taken their share. In ordinary years, animals brought rhythm to a household. Milking at dawn, dung for the fields, wool in season, transport to market, power in the furrow. In famine, they became one more reserve to be spent, and then, once spent, one more absence to live with. The seed grain may have been worse. To eat seed is to cross a line that people in agricultural societies understood without needing it explained. It is not only food, it is next year disguised as food. But hunger has its own logic, and it is much more immediate than hope. If there was a child in the house with a swollen belly or a labouring man too weak to stand for long, The sack of seed in the corner no longer belonged fully to the future. It belonged partly to that evening, to that week, to the possibility of enduring until something changed. Many people reached for it because they had run out of things less destructive to sacrifice. Chroniclers and later historians alike describe the mortgaging of the future in just this way. People ate what should have planted recovery, and every such meal made the next season more fragile. And while the countryside was making these intimate bargains, towns and markets were changing character as well. A medieval market in hard times was not merely a place of exchange, it was an emotional theatre. You could read the condition of a region in faces, in the size of sacks, in the grain itself, in the tense little pauses before people named a price. Bread mattered especially because bread measured order. In many towns, authorities tried to regulate weight, quality, and sale. There were long traditions of supervising bakers and grain dealers, because everyone understood that dearth could turn quickly into anger. But regulation worked only within limits. When harvest failed over a wide enough area, rules could not create abundance. They could only distribute frustration. The assize of bread might still exist. The oven might still be hot. Yet the loaf emerging from it was dearer, smaller, darker, or adulterated with coarser mixtures that a better year would have rejected. Those who had coin could still outbid those who did not. That simple fact sharpened the social pain of famine. Hunger was shared, but not equally. A wealthy household might complain of rising costs and reduced variety while still laying out several dishes. A poor labourer might spend nearly everything on coarse bread and still not have enough. This is one reason famine often left behind not only graves but bitterness. It made social hierarchy visible at the table. In a world already arranged by status, famine translated rank into calories. You can almost hear the resentments gathering in a narrow lane outside a bakehouse. The rumour that someone is hoarding. The accusation that merchants are holding grain back. The muttered judgment against a lord's full granary or a monastery's stores. In times like this, morality and economics become tangled. People do not experience scarcity as a chart. They experience it as a neighbour's cart leaving town, as a guarded barn, as a child crying from hunger within earshot of a wealthy kitchen. Medieval governments and local authorities were not powerless, but they were far less capable than modern states of moving food at scale, stabilizing prices across regions, or insulating the poor from cascading failures. The system could exhort, punish, inspect, and pray. It could not easily reverse the weather or restore the lost reserves of an entire countryside, and so people looked sideways for survival. Kin mattered, neighbours mattered. So did lords, abbeys, parish structures, village customs, and the fragile economy of favour. Someone might lend grain, someone might extend a due date, someone might allow gleaning, grazing, or gathering where the rules were usually tighter. But famine also tested the limits of charity. A household with little to spare does not become generous simply because suffering is widespread. It often becomes defensive. Doors close earlier, bins are watched more closely. Obligations are remembered with unusual precision. Need makes people lean on one another, but it also makes them suspicious of being leaned on too hard. For the landless and half-landless, things grew even more precarious. A servant dismissed from a household that could no longer feed extra mouths had few good options. A day labourer without steady hiring might drift toward a town, a monastery gate, a roadside economy of begging, theft, and petition. Movement itself became a survival strategy. Not migration in the modern romantic sense, but grim practical circulation. Walking farther for work, for alms, for news of cheaper grain, for kin who might still have room near their hearth. Roads filled not with opportunity, but with exposure. Wet cloaks, raw heels, poor lodging. And the knowledge that every stranger at the next gate might be another hungry body competing for the same mercy. In some regions, the pressure on commons and marginal foods intensified. People gathered more aggressively from woods, heaths, marsh edges and riverbanks. Whatever could be boiled, ground, stretched, trapped or chewed entered the economy of survival. Famine food is rarely the stuff of legend while it is being eaten. It is bitter bark mixed into meal, inferior grains, spoiled stores trimmed and salvaged, herbs and roots taken in quantities that speak of desperation more than cuisine. The line between food and not quite food shifts when the body is losing the argument. And when everyone begins reaching for the same fallback resources, those too become scarce. The emotional weather of a community changes under those conditions. People become quicker to quarrel and slower to trust. Petty theft feels less petty. A missing chicken, a loosened latch, a trampled patch of ground, a handful of grain gone from storage. These can carry the force of catastrophe when there is almost nothing to replace them. Chroniclers of the famine years speak of rising disorder and harsher behaviour, though they were often men writing from monasteries or administrative centres, and they tended to record extremes. Even so, the broad picture is clear enough. Prolonged hunger coarsened daily life. Not because medieval people were uniquely savage, but because famine strips away the small cushions that make patience possible. And then there were the stories people told when conditions became nearly unbearable. Some chroniclers reported abandonment of children, voluntary self-starvation among the elderly, and even cannibalism. These are among the darkest claims attached to the Great Famine, and historians treat the most sensational reports cautiously. Chroniclers often favoured horror when they wanted to express moral collapse or divine punishment. Still, the existence of such rumours tells us something important, even where literal proof is thin. It tells us how famine was experienced in the imagination of the time, as a force that pushed human beings toward the edge of what a Christian society believed a person should do. When starvation becomes the background of life, the boundary between the conceivable and the unthinkable begins to fray. What survived, surprisingly often, were the smallest gestures. A bowl shared more thinly than pride would prefer. A place near the fire offered to someone who arrived soaked through. A neighbour warning another that prices were lower in the next town. A mother pretending she was not hungry so that a child would eat without shame. Medieval sources are more likely to record catastrophe than tenderness, more likely to preserve the actions of kings, abbots and officials than the quiet decency of exhausted people. But no society lives through years like these by cruelty alone. Survival also depends on ordinary mercy, on the unrecorded decisions by which one person makes another person's night slightly less terrible. By late 1316, however, mercy was under strain everywhere. Another failed season meant not just another winter of shortage, but a dangerous inheritance of weakness. Bodies were more vulnerable to disease, fields had been poorly worked, herds had thinned, debt had deepened. Confidence in earthly authority was wearing down, and prayer, however sincere, had not restored the granaries. Europe had not merely entered a famine, it had entered the kind of long emergency that remakes what people believe about security, power, and the body's limits. And with that came a colder realization. Hunger was no longer only in the villages and cottages, no longer only in the muddy fields and poor quarters of towns. It was moving through the whole social order, testing every bond that claimed to hold the world together. Once hunger settles into a body, the world begins to change shape. At first, it is only a slight thinning of the face, a quickness to tire, a strange lightness in the arms when lifting something ordinary. Then the body begins to bargain in quieter ways. It gives up warmth first. Fingers stay cold. Feet feel damp even by the fire. Sleep becomes shallow, not because the day has been easy, but because the body is now waking itself inside the night, asking for what it is not getting. A person can still walk, still work, still answer when spoken to, and yet already be living inside a slow emergency. During the Great Famine, this was one of the least visible and most decisive changes. Before death, there was weakening. Before collapse, there was depletion. The crisis moved through Europe not only as empty granaries and high prices, but as thousands of ordinary bodies becoming less able to resist the world. That mattered because medieval life demanded resilience constantly. A bad back, a fever, a lingering cough, a cut that would not close, a child's stomach sickness, a winter chill that settled too long in the chest. These were already serious matters in a time without modern medicine. Hunger made each of them more dangerous. It reduced the body's margin for survival. A woman nursing a child while eating badly herself could not conjure strength from devotion alone. An elderly man whose teeth already made coarse bread difficult to chew could not simply will his stomach to hold out. A labourer whose muscles were his livelihood could not sell skill separately from flesh. In years of famine, weakness did not arrive as a separate tragedy. It braided itself into everything. This is one reason historians now see the Great Famine not as a single event of starvation, but as a layered biological crisis. People died not only because food vanished outright, but because prolonged malnutrition left them vulnerable to illness, infection, and every small injury or disease that healthier years might have absorbed. Medieval chroniclers were not writing medical case notes, yet their descriptions carry the feeling of a population being worn down, not struck once, but steadily emptied. Hunger lengthened the shadow of every other danger, and the medieval household was the place where that slow unravelling became impossible to ignore. Picture the room again. The same low rafters darkened by smoke, the same bench near the wall, the same pot hanging over the fire, except now there is less in it, and what is in it nourishes poorly. Meals lose shape before they disappear. A household that once had bread and pottage might still have pottage, but thinner. Bread, but mixed with inferior grain. Ale, but weak. Salted food, but no longer enough. The routine remains, but the substance drains away. The body notices this with a kind of dull clarity. Food no longer satisfies, it merely interrupts hunger for a little while. A child becomes fretful or oddly quiet. Adults begin speaking less at table, because talking does not make a bowl heavier. The smell of cooking, once reassuring, becomes almost cruel when it promises more than the meal can deliver. There is a fatigue that belongs to hard work, and another that belongs to underfeeding. The second is colder, flatter, and harder to hide. Children were among the most vulnerable, though they do not always appear clearly in the records. Medieval sources were better at preserving transactions than tenderness, better at noting rents and grain than the texture of a mother's fear. Yet the logic is inescapable. Children needed food to grow, warmth to stay well, adults strong enough to carry and protect them. Famine attacked all three at once. A child could become sick more quickly, recover more slowly, and depend on caregivers whose own strength was fading. Even households that managed to keep children alive might do so by worsening the condition of the adults, especially women, whose labour within the home was constant and whose sacrifices often went unrecorded. A mother could reduce her own portion, stretch the pot one more time, stay up longer with a sick child, and still rise before dawn to begin again. No chronicler standing at a monastery window would have counted her efforts. But famine rested heavily on work like hers, and her pregnancy and nursing must have been especially perilous. A medieval woman already moved through childbirth with risks that modern people can scarcely imagine. In famine years, those risks sharpened. Less food meant less strength for labour, less resistance to bleeding or fever, less milk, less recovery. The quiet heroism of keeping a household alive under ordinary conditions became something harsher under famine, a repeated act of choosing where the little available nourishment would go, who could work, who could be spared, who should be told there was no more. There are many ways a society suffers. One of them is by asking its women to keep order inside disorder without ever admitting how impossible that task has become. Outside the household, the village itself began to change in tone. Not all at once and not evenly, but enough to be felt. There were fewer animals in some yards, fewer good smells from ovens, less noise of repair and maintenance. Tools wore out and were not replaced. Clothing was patched past dignity. People who should have looked sturdy by summer looked washed out instead, their faces sharpened, their movements slower, their tempers harder to predict. Hunger has a social presence. It alters the energy of a place long before it empties it. Even the church, which stood at the centre of medieval emotional life, was drawn into the crisis in complicated ways. Churches offered ritual, intercession, calendar, and meaning. Their bells marked time when ordinary time felt frayed. Their prayers gave suffering language. Their feasts and fasts framed the year, and their alms could, at least sometimes, soften the edge of need. Monasteries and religious houses might distribute charity, feed the poor at the gate, or offer some relief to the desperate. Yet they were also institutions embedded in the same failing economy. They depended on rents, tithes, stores, and harvests that were themselves under pressure. They could not multiply bread indefinitely. So famine exposed something uncomfortable even within sacred life, the limits of consolation when material conditions have turned hostile. Still, people went on praying. They had little reason not to. Faith was not a decorative layer over medieval life. It was one of the ways the world made sense. If the rains did not stop, if crops failed again, if livestock died and children weakened, then these things had to be fitted somehow into a moral universe. That did not always bring peace. It could bring guilt, fear, or anger, bewilderment. A bad harvest might be interpreted as punishment, but punishment for whom exactly? For personal sin? For collective failure? For rulers? For a corrupt age? Calamity in the Middle Ages often invited explanation, and explanation often invited anxiety. The heavens seemed active, but not necessarily intelligible. There is a particular loneliness in that. Not the loneliness of physical isolation, though famine could certainly bring that too, but the loneliness of living in a world that appears to be speaking in disaster. You continue to kneel, to cross yourself, to light candles, to walk the familiar path to worship, and yet what surrounds you remains wet, hungry, and increasingly cruel. The old assurances do not vanish, but they become harder to feel in the body. A person may believe deeply and still wake afraid, yet that fear also travelled through authority. Lords faced their own version of the crisis, though cushioned by privilege. Their income came from land and tenants, from customary dues, from seigneurial rights, from stores that might be better protected than a peasant's tiny reserve. But when harvests failed, tenants struggled to pay. Livestock losses reduced output. Labour shortages and illness affected estate routines. A manor could not stand entirely apart from the countryside that sustained it. Some landlords offered temporary leniency, delayed collections, or reduced pressure where circumstances forced it. Others enforced obligations more sharply, perhaps out of need, perhaps out of habit, perhaps because hierarchy often becomes more rigid when disorder rises beneath it. Famine did not erase power. In some places, it made power feel colder. And then there were the people who fell out of the ordinary web altogether. The wanderers, the beggars, the dismissed servants, the orphaned, the elderly with no strong kin network left, the sick poor, whose weakness made them hard to employ and hard to ignore. Medieval towns were familiar with poverty, roads were familiar with petitioners, but in prolonged dearth, these categories swell. A hungry stranger at the edge of a settlement is one thing. 10 hungry strangers, then 20, then a visible stream of them moving through the landscape is another. Charity, already selective in ordinary years, begins to harden into triage. Gates close more quickly. Suspicion rises. A person asking for help might be pitied, feared, resented, or all three. It is easy, from a distance of centuries, to imagine famine as a great levelling darkness. In truth, it sharpened distinctions even as it spread misery. The poor died earlier. The marginal suffered more visibly. But the better off live closer to fear than usual, and that matters too. When elites worry about bread supply, when royal and seigneurial households find provisioning more difficult, when monastic chroniclers describe weather with something like dread, you can sense a whole civilization becoming aware of its own fragility. Medieval Europe was not weak exactly. It was organized for a world in which harvest failure was always possible, but it was not built to absorb repeated, widespread failure without deep damage. The body keeps the score of that damage in ways ledgers do not. A man who survives famine may emerge smaller in strength than before. A child who lives through hunger may carry its effects in growth, resistance, and development. A woman who keeps her family alive through repeated privation may age faster than the years alone would explain. The famine did not simply remove lives, it altered the quality of surviving life. Recovery, when it came, would not arrive to a clean slate. It would arrive to bodies already taxed, communities already thinned, households already stripped of tools, animals, seed, and confidence. And confidence may be one of the most important things famine destroys. Not optimism in the abstract, but the ordinary trust that next year will broadly resemble this one, that labour will usually result in sustenance, that a household can make plans extending beyond the next few weeks. Medieval people were no strangers to uncertainty. Yet life still depended on practical expectation. You sowed because there would likely be a harvest. You kept a calf because there would likely be fodder. You married, rented, borrowed, bought, and promised, within a world that usually repeated its main rhythms. The Great Famine interrupted that repetition so severely that even when food reappeared in some quantity, faith in normality would have been slower to return. By the middle of the crisis, then, survival meant more than finding something to eat. It meant enduring weakness without surrendering routine entirely. It meant caring for children while ill yourself. It meant bargaining with landlords, merchants, and neighbours while trying not to lose standing altogether. It meant walking farther, swallowing pride more often, and learning how thin a person can become while still expected to work, pray, obey, and carry on. And as the hunger moved through the body, it also moved through the mind. People became more watchful, more superstitious perhaps, more prone to read signs in weather, accidents, illnesses, and rumours. The world had become less reliable, and when the world grows unreliable, rumour becomes its own kind of weather. News of food in one district, theft in another, charity at a monastery gate, a family reduced to begging, an official punishing hoarders, children found abandoned, God's anger, God's testing, a better market 2 days away, a road too dangerous to travel. Such reports circulated through taverns, porches, churchyards, and muddy lanes, changing mood as they went. That mood was not constant despair. Human beings are not built that way. Or even in famine there were days of ordinary talk, flashes of humour, practical competence, the stubborn maintenance of dignity. People repaired shoes, mended garments, swept floors, cut wood, coaxed fires, comforted the frightened, and did what they could to preserve the shape of life. But underneath it all, a new fact had settled in. The body could fail more quickly than memory had prepared them to accept. And once a society learns that lesson, another question follows close behind. If hunger has stripped people this far, what happens when law, order, and custom begin to fray with it? When hunger continues long enough, law begins to feel different. Not because statutes vanish, or because officials simply disappear into the rain. Yes, but because every familiar rule now stands in a world where more people are desperate than the rule was built to contain. A village still has its customs. A town still has its markets, its officers, its courts, its expectations of order. A manor still has dues to collect and wrongs to judge. But famine alters the emotional temperature in which all of these things operate. A missing sack is no longer an inconvenience. A poached animal is no longer merely a trespass. A loaf hidden away can look, from the outside, like a moral crime. Hunger sharpens both need and accusation. This is why the social history of the Great Famine is not only a history of starvation, it is also a history of trust under pressure. In ordinary years, medieval communities lived by a dense fabric of mutual dependence. People borrowed tools, witnessed agreements, watched one another's animals, gossiped over boundaries, traded favours, and carried long memories of insult and obligation. It was not an idyllic world. It could be suspicious, rigid, and deeply unequal. But it functioned through repetition. You knew who owed what. You knew whose field bordered yours, whose children were likely to steal fruit, whose temper could be managed, whose word was good in a dispute. Famine did not erase those relationships. It made them more dangerous. A person you had known for 20 years might now be the one who refused you grain, or the one you suspected of taking it, and suspicion, once it enters a hungry place, multiplies quickly. One can imagine the small scenes. A storehouse door checked twice before sleep. A hen counted in the dusk, footprints near a bin. A whispered claim that someone is mixing bad grain and selling it dear. A widow blamed for gleaning too early. A servant accused before proof is certain, because need has already made him plausible. The emotional life of scarcity is full of these half-certainties. People begin interpreting ordinary behaviour through the lens of want. Privacy looks like hoarding. Movement looks like theft. Silence looks like guilt. The surviving records from England suggest that theft did indeed grow more visible during the famine years, though not in the grand, theatrical form that later centuries sometimes imagine. In the West Riding and other places, court material from 1315 to 1317 includes what historians call hungry theft, foodstuffs and essential goods taken under the pressure of want. One set of records speaks of the great number of thieves, while individual cases mention stolen oats, flour, meat, clothing, valuables, and even sheep. Significantly, this pattern fades after the famine years in those same records, which suggests that the crisis itself had pushed theft into sharper prominence. That phrase, hungry theft, has a bleak gentleness to it. It sounds almost polite until you remember what it means. Not professional banditry in the romantic sense, not rebellion with banners. More often the furtive, humiliating, highly local act of someone taking what can be carried, eaten, worn, or sold, because the household has run out of tolerable options. Hunger drives people downward into the practical. A handful of grain, a side of meat, a garment, an animal in the night. Necessity is rarely theatrical while it is happening. Yet the law did not necessarily become kinder because motives were understandable. In England, theft already sat under a severe legal shadow before the famine began. By the later 13th century, larceny above a value of 12 pence could expose a person to capital punishment, at least in principle. That meant that in a time of dearth, the gap between survival and felony could be terrifyingly small. A poor person stealing enough to matter might also be stealing enough to die for. Whether every case was pursued to its harshest end is another matter. Medieval justice was uneven, negotiated, local, and often shaped by juries, custom, reputation, and circumstance. But the threat itself mattered. Famine did not unfold in a moral vacuum. It unfolded under institutions that could pity, condemn, hesitate, or punish. There is something especially cruel in that intersection between bodily need and public shame. To beg is one kind of exposure. To steal and be accused is another. Medieval communities did not forget easily. A person brought before a court for taking food was not only at risk of legal penalty, he or she was at risk of becoming known as the sort of person who had crossed the line. But famine blurs that line in the minds of those watching. A juror might condemn and still understand. A neighbour might whisper disapproval while knowing privately that his own cupboard stands only a little higher above emptiness. In this way, famine complicates morality without dissolving it. People remain judgmental, but they do so inside a world where many can suddenly imagine the temptation. Not all disorder took the form of theft. Some of it was quieter and harder to record. Contracts frayed, rents went unpaid, debts were deferred, disputed or quietly abandoned. Hired servants disappeared in search of better prospects, or simply because one meal elsewhere was worth the risk of walking. Village obligations that depended on labour, equipment, or goodwill became harder to maintain. Roads and drainage, already fragile, suffered when communities lacked the energy or resources to keep them properly. The outer shape of the order could remain in place while its daily functioning grew thinner. A medieval society did not need open riot to become unstable. It only needed enough small failures accumulating at once. And that is one of the striking things about the English evidence. Despite severe dearth, the clearest documented food riots come later, in 1347, not during the Great Famine itself. That does not mean the famine years were peaceful, far from it. It suggests instead that much of the strain in 1315 to 1317 was born through household desperation, private theft, local coercion, market anxiety, and administrative pressure rather than through large organised crowd action of the kind later centuries would make more visible. In other words, famine often worked by grinding communities down rather than by instantly driving them into open insurrection. Meanwhile, authorities did try to act, though their capacity was limited and their success uncertain. The English crown under Edward II responded with measures aimed at preserving supply and disciplining the market. Prohibitions on the export of grain were issued, and the import of grain from overseas was encouraged by allowing it to enter England custom-free. In 1316, Edward II sent a letter to the bishops, and in 1317 a royal proclamation forbade the use of barley in brewing ale, an attempt to push bread grains away from drink and back towards subsistence. These actions reveal a government that recognised the scale of the emergency and reached for the tools available to it: regulation, proclamation, moral pressure, and the management of trade. But a proclamation cannot dry a field, and a kingdom with limited administrative reach, poor transport by modern standards, weak storage relative to need, and a largely local grain economy could only do so much once repeated harvest failures had spread across wide regions. The Crown could ban exports, urge imports, remind bishops of their duties, and try to hold the moral centre of the market. Yet the practical burden of survival still fell downward, onto individual households, parishes, towns, lords, and monasteries. One of the most painful truths of the Great Famine is that authority existed, but abundance did not. The state was present, but not omnipotent. You can feel this especially in the marketplace. Picture a town square under a grey sky, the ground slick beneath carts, sacks, and shoes. An officer inspects weights. A buyer argues. A seller swears he has no more. Someone mutters about forestallers, about people buying early and reselling dear, about merchants who always seem to profit while others weaken. Medieval governments had long tried to regulate grain and bread because grain was never merely a commodity. It was the foundation of social peace. But the more essential a thing becomes, the more every transaction around it begins to look political. Was a high price a necessity, an opportunity, or a sin? Was the merchant prudent or heartless? Was the official enforcing order or protecting privilege? Famine turns economics into character judgment, and character judgment in a religious society rarely stops at the market stall. The famine years were interpreted morally as well as materially. Preachers, chroniclers, and ordinary believers did not experience scarcity as a neutral accident. They searched for causes in sin, greed, divine anger, failed leadership, and communal corruption. Hoarding was not just an economic act. It could be imagined as a violation of Christian duty. Profiting from dearth could look not merely harsh, but spiritually dangerous. Yet these moral languages did not magically resolve the crisis. They intensified it in another direction. A hungry world full of moral accusation is not necessarily a generous world. It is often a world where judgment thickens along with fear. In such a world, even charity grows complicated. Who deserves help? The local poor first, or the strangers at the gate? The honest widow before the able-bodied wanderer? The household that still has some tools left, or the one already reduced to rags? Monasteries and churches could distribute alms, and some did. Lords might remit or delay certain demands. Towns might make efforts to keep bread available. But whenever resources are too small for the need, mercy becomes selective. That selectiveness can wound almost as much as the shortage itself. The person turned away does not experience policy. He experiences exclusion, and still the roads filled. Some people moved because they had been pushed out of service, some because their home district offered nothing, some because rumour said grain could be had elsewhere, some because kin lived a day or two away and had not yet closed their door. The movement of the hungry changed the way stable communities saw the outside world. A stranger was no longer simply unfamiliar. He was a claimant, another stomach, another risk, another possible thief. This does not mean that medieval villages and towns became uniformly cruel. Many acts of kindness surely occurred. But under prolonged stress, hospitality becomes more expensive, and the price is felt by those with the least power to insist. The chroniclers, who mostly wrote from literate and relatively sheltered institutions, sometimes recorded the famine in tones of horror that seem almost apocalyptic. They described unnatural acts, dreadful weather, and a social order touched by desperation. Modern historians treat the most extreme stories carefully, because chroniclers were also stylists, moralists, and men drawn to the language of catastrophe. Yet even when we discount exaggeration, their emotional testimony still matters. They were witnessing a society in which ordinary assumptions about security, decency, and predictability were being publicly tested. The fact that rumour itself became so dark tells us how far fear had travelled. Perhaps the deepest wound to order was not crime, however, it was erosion. The slow erosion of expectation. The idea that promises would hold, that dues could be paid, that next quarter's work could be planned, that a servant would remain, that a neighbour would lend, that a child could be fed through winter without selling something irreversible. This kind of erosion does not produce one dramatic image. It produces 1,000 small adjustments, each one lowering the standard of what counts as normal. People get used to less light, less bread, less trust, less patience. And once that becomes familiar, a society has changed even if its institutions still stand. By the end of 1317, that change could be felt far beyond any single cottage or parish. The famine had revealed how fragile the boundary was between order and need, and how much of medieval life depended on modest reserves that, once exhausted, could not easily be rebuilt. It had shown that kings could proclaim, bishops could pray, officials could inspect, and courts could punish, yet none of them could force the land to recover on command. It had shown that law remained, but in a weakened world law alone could not feed anyone. And as the rains slowly loosened their grip in some places, a different question began to emerge. Not whether people could endure another week of hunger, many still could not, but what kind of world would remain when the immediate terror eased. Because famine does not end cleanly. It leaves behind debt, sickness, empty byres, thinned households, and a countryside that must somehow begin again with fewer tools, fewer animals, and many fewer illusions. When the worst of a famine begins to loosen, relief does not arrive like a trumpet. It comes unevenly, with hesitation, and often too late for those who have already been broken by the years behind them. A little less rain. A field that finally holds its shape underfoot. A patch of grain that looks merely thin instead of ruined. A market day where the price is still punishing, but not impossible. The world does not suddenly become generous again. It simply stops pressing quite so hard. And for people who have spent years measuring life by hunger, that small easing can feel almost unreal. But by the time the skies began to relent in parts of Europe, the damage of the Great Famine had already sunk far deeper than empty stomachs. A countryside cannot be starved for several seasons and then resume as if nothing has happened. Fields may still exist, but the strength required to work them has been drained. Seed has been consumed. Tools have been sold or neglected. Draft animals are gone from many holdings. Fences sag, roofs leak, ditches clog. And just so, manure is scarcer because livestock are scarcer, and without manure, even recovery in the fields becomes thinner. The entire agricultural cycle, already delicate in ordinary years, now has to restart with less power behind it. This is one of the hardest things for a modern imagination to grasp. Medieval farming was not only about land, it was about a chain of living supports that all depended on one another. A field needed seed, but also labour, traction, timing, storage, and enough confidence to invest effort now for food months later. A peasant household needed not only bread in hand, but the means to make future bread possible. Famine had torn through that chain link by link. So even if the weather improved, people did not stand there in 1318 or after with fresh strength, fresh animals, fresh stores, and clean hope. They stood there already diminished, and still they had to begin again. Imagine a man taking hold of a plough handle, with hands made rougher and lighter than they were a few years before. His shoulders know the motion, but the body behind them is different now. Imagine a widow counting out the grain she has somehow managed not to eat, wondering whether to risk it on land that may or may not return enough. Imagine children who have lived through shortage now old enough to work in small ways, but not strong enough for the tasks the household once expected from them. Recovery is not a clean line upward. It is a limping return, half practical and half emotional. The emotional part matters more than statistics usually allow. During famine, people learn not to trust abundance too quickly. They learn that a full bowl can become a thin one, that a promising spring can rot into misery, that plans may have to be eaten before they are lived. This kind of knowledge settles into behaviour. A family that has been through repeated failure may become more cautious, more guarded, more likely to hide reserve when it can. They save harder, they spend less freely. They look at weather with suspicion. Even a good season can feel temporary when the memory of bad ones remains so vivid. And memory in a medieval village would not have been private. Everyone could see who had made it through and who had not. The missing body at church, the byre that stood emptier than before, the cottage whose roof had not been mended because there were no hands or no money left to mend it, the child who had once been lively now quieter, smaller, older in the face than children ought to be. A famine changes the appearance of a community long after the crisis itself has passed. It rearranges not only property and labour, but memory. People remember who lent grain, who refused it, who profited, who buried children, who took service elsewhere and never returned, who was reduced to begging, who lost nearly everything and somehow remained standing. That memory could soften people. It could also harden them. There is a temptation to imagine suffering as automatically noble, as if hardship must produce wisdom, tenderness, or deep communal understanding. Sometimes it does. More often it produces a complicated mixture of gratitude, resentment, pride, fear, and silence. Some people will remember the little mercies that got them through. Others will remember humiliation more clearly than kindness. A man who sold his best tool to survive may never again look at dependency without bitterness. A woman who stood in a queue for bread or alms may remember the cold shape of shame even after hunger eases. Recovery does not erase the emotional cost of having needed too much from a world unwilling or unable to give it. The social order too emerged altered. For lords and estate managers, the famine years exposed how vulnerable their revenues were to the physical condition of ordinary tenants. If peasants weakened, died, fled, or lost their animals, the whole manorial system suffered with them. Rent and labour services became harder to extract cleanly. Some holdings were left under pressure. Some tenants sank into arrears so deep that ordinary expectations had to be adjusted, postponed, or enforced with increasing tension. A lord might still possess title, rights, courts, and claims, but rights did not plough land. Power could command. It could not make a dead ox pull or a malnourished peasant work as before. This does not mean hierarchy collapsed. It did not. Medieval Europe remained deeply structured by status, landholding, obligation, and privilege, but famine exposed those structures as more dependent on peasant endurance than elites may have preferred to admit. A village was not simply a place where dues were collected. It was a living system of bodies, animals, seasons, and habits. When that system was weakened, even the powerful had to confront a basic truth. Control over land meant less if the land's working population had been wrung nearly dry. In towns, the picture was different, but no less scarred. The famine had strained markets, was sharpened suspicion, and made the price of bread a matter of social temperature. Even after the worst dearth passed, confidence in sellers, authorities, and provisioning did not necessarily return at once. People remembered what grain had cost. They remembered the quality of loaves, the rumours of hoarding, the sense that ordinary exchange had become a site of fear. Markets might recover in function before they recovered in trust. And then there were the people who had moved. Some went home if home was still there to return to. Others did not. A servant who had wandered in search of food or work might settle in a different place, or die on the road, or remain attached to a monastery, household, or town that had once offered temporary survival. Children orphaned or separated during the years of famine did not simply resume their former family life. The elderly who had exhausted kin networks could not be restored to the secure position they had lost. Movement during famine is often messy and under-recorded, but its consequences remain. Communities lose some people and absorb others. The familiar map of belonging becomes a little less stable. There is also the quieter question of marriage and birth. Bad years can delay marriage, discourage households from forming, and alter the age structure of a community without anyone standing in the village square to announce that fact. If food is uncertain, if wages are unstable, if land is under strain, then young people may have fewer ways to begin independent lives. If women are weakened by hunger, if infants are born into scarcity, if sickness follows poor nourishment, then the future population of a village may already be changing before anyone has language for what is happening. Famine is not only an interruption in the present, it is a theft from the future, and the future, in early 14th century Europe, would prove grimly willing to be stolen from again. That is one reason the Great Famine feels so haunting in retrospect. It did not occur in isolation. It belongs to a troubled century, one in which climatic instability, economic pressure, war, political weakness, and disease would repeatedly reveal how exposed medieval societies could be. The famine was not the Black Death, and it should not be collapsed into that later catastrophe. But it did leave Europe more vulnerable than before. A population weakened by hunger and shaped by recent trauma does not greet later calamity from a position of strength. It greets it already acquainted with fragility. Still, daily life resumed, because daily life always does when it can. Women returned to baking with whatever grain could be spared. Men repaired carts, mended roofs, and tried once more to trust the earth enough to sow into it. Children gathered wood, watched animals, carried water, and learned the habits of households that had become more careful than before. Bells rang, markets opened, rents were argued over, bread was still cut at tables, though perhaps with more caution now, and more reverence than anyone would have named aloud. It is often after a crisis, not during it, that ordinary objects recover their emotional weight. A sack of grain, a healthy calf, a sealed bin, dry hay, a loaf thick enough to satisfy. Each of these could become, after famine, not merely useful but almost sacred in feeling. Because medieval life rested so heavily on repetition, recovery also meant restoring rhythm. Not happiness exactly, not security in any final sense, but rhythm. The right tasks in the right seasons, the plough before sowing, the cut hay before the rains, the bins checked and sealed, the animals brought through winter, the ale brewed from what could be spared. The oven used not in dread but in expectation. Rhythm is what lets people imagine a future again. It is what turned survival back into living. Yet even as rhythm returned, the famine remained inside the culture as a warning. People told stories about hard years long after they were over, not always in grand historical language, and not necessarily in forms that survive neatly in written sources. But memory of dearth lingered in household caution, village sayings, clerical writing, estate practice, and the bodily knowledge of those who had endured it. An old woman who had lived through 1315 might save crumbs differently for the rest of her life. A man who had watched a parent sell seed grain might never again assume that next year was a safe phrase. Memory becomes custom when enough people carry the same wound. There is something almost unbearable in that thought, not because it is dramatic, but because it is so ordinary. History is often imagined as battles, treaties, crowns, and dates. Yet much of what shapes human life settles at a lower level than that. In how tightly a cupboard is closed, in how fast food is served at a table, in how suspiciously a dark sky is watched in midsummer, in the way a community stores, shares, withholds, or blesses bread. The Great Famine was, among many things, a lesson in dependence that medieval Europeans did not ask to learn so harshly. It taught them how thin the line could be between labour and loss, between order and fear, between an ordinary season and a years-long descent into hunger. It showed that survival often depended not on heroic acts, but on unglamorous choices, stretching pottage, selling tools, slaughtering animals too early, borrowing from neighbours, walking farther, enduring shame, praying without visible answer, rising each day into another wet morning and doing what could still be done. And perhaps that is why the famine still feels close, even across 7 centuries. Sus because at its centre is not an abstract crisis, but a human pattern we recognise immediately. People preserving one another where they can, people failing one another where they cannot. Systems proving thinner than they looked, ordinary objects becoming precious. Hope surviving, though chastened and quieter than before. By the time Europe began to move beyond the worst of those years, it was not the same Europe that had entered them. Too much had been sold, buried, weakened, or remembered. Too much had been learned about the cost of a sky that would not clear. And in the years that followed, another question lingered beneath all the practical work of rebuilding. Not just how people had survived, but what exactly survival had turned them into. What survival had turned them into was not something visible all at once. There was no single morning when Europe looked into a polished surface and saw that it had become leaner, harder, more cautious, less innocent about bread. Change after famine moves quietly. It settles into posture, thrift, suspicion, prayer, and appetite. It enters the house before it enters the chronicle. A woman folds a scrap of cloth for later instead of throwing it away. A man counts the grain in a bin with a care he did not once consider necessary. A child learns not to waste crumbs because the adults around him have taught that lesson not with speeches, but with the speed of their hands. The famine years had killed widely, though not evenly. Historians still debate exact totals, but broad estimates suggest that in many affected areas perhaps 1/10 to 1/7 of the population died from starvation and the diseases that followed hunger, with some regional studies in places like Flanders also pointing to losses around 10 to 15%. The suffering stretched beyond 1317 in some districts, and recovery in food supply and population was slow enough that some scholars place genuine normalization only in the early 1320s. That kind of mortality does not simply reduce numbers, it changes the emotional arrangement of the living. A medieval village after the famine would still have its lanes, fields, ovens, and bells, but it would also have absences that had become part of the landscape, an empty holding, a bed no longer slept in, a tool hung up because the hand that used it was gone. Medieval people did not live in a culture that expected privacy around grief in the modern sense. Death was communal, visible, handled within the neighbourhood of daily life. Yet repeated loss has a numbing force. If too many funerals pass through the churchyard in too short a span, sorrow itself begins to flatten into endurance, and endurance was now the dominant habit. The years of dearth had taught households to survive by shaving away comfort first, then dignity, then possibility. When grain prices rose to unprecedented levels in England after the harvest failures of 1315 and 1316, the buying power of ordinary workers collapsed. One economic reconstruction suggests that farm workers' purchasing power shrank by roughly a third and building workers by about a half in those years. Even behind those figures stood 1,000 private degradations, meals skipped, possessions sold, labour undertaken while weak, journeys made in rain for food that might not be there when one arrived. So even when conditions improved, people did not simply return to an old emotional baseline. They had learned a harsher arithmetic. A loaf was no longer just a loaf. It was weather, labour, storage, luck, and the memory of not having one. Hay was not just winter feed. It was the difference between keeping an animal alive and losing the muscle that pulled next year's plough. A sack of seed grain was not just seed. It was a moral test, because famine had shown how thin the line could become between planting the future and eating it before morning. Once a society has been driven into choices like that, ordinary objects never feel entirely ordinary again. This is one reason famines linger culturally long after they end. They educate people in fear, not always in loud fear, often in practical fear. The careful wrapping of food, the instinct to save the better portion, the unwillingness to trust one fine summer after years of wet ones. Medieval people already lived with uncertainty more intimately than most modern people do, but the Great Famine taught them that several bad years could arrive together, that the land could remain hostile for longer than memory found reasonable, and that neither prayer nor authority could guarantee timely rescue. That lesson was unlikely to be forgotten by those who had survived on the edge of it. There was also a broader hardening in social life. It would be too simple to say that famine made medieval Europe violent, because medieval Europe was already a world of harsh punishments, armed lordship, and everyday insecurity. Still, some historians argue that the famine years helped deepen a rougher social atmosphere by normalizing extreme desperation, eroding trust, and exposing how fragile ordinary restraint could be when people were hungry. Contemporary and near-contemporary observers repeatedly linked the dearth to rising theft, disorder, and a grimmer mood in public life. Famine did not invent cruelty, but it gave cruelty fresh work to do. And the Church, for all its centrality, did not emerge untouched. Medieval men and women had prayed through this disaster with seriousness, fear, and sincerity. They had processed, fasted, confessed, petitioned saints, listened to sermons, and interpreted weather through a moral vocabulary that made divine purpose difficult to separate from material suffering. Yet no amount of prayer stopped the rain. No liturgy restored seed grain already eaten. No procession cured a weak child's hunger. Some historians see in the famine years a quiet weakening of confidence in established institutions, including the Church. Not because faith vanished, but because the scale of the catastrophe revealed how limited the practical reach of spiritual authority could be in the face of ecological collapse. That disappointment would not always have been spoken openly. More often, it would have been lived as a private ache. A person still goes to Mass, still kneels, still crosses herself before eating, still asks blessing on a field. But the confidence behind these actions may have changed. Faith after famine can remain real while also becoming more wounded, more urgent, more brittle. The heavens are still there, but they have recently been silent in a way that hurts. A society can continue believing and yet believe with more strain than before. The land itself offered no quick comfort either. Even after the human famine eased, another blow followed in parts of northwestern Europe, a devastating bovine pestilence in 1319 to 1321 that sharply reduced cattle numbers. In England and Wales, one estimate places bovine mortality at about 62%. For a world that depended on cattle not only for meat but for traction, manure, dairy, and status, this meant that recovery after hunger was struck again at one of its foundations. It is difficult to imagine a more discouraging sequence. First the rain, then the hunger, then the loss of animals needed to rebuild. You can feel the hopelessness that must have accompanied such a sequence. A family that had survived by selling or slaughtering part of its stock might have looked toward better seasons with exhausted determination, only to see disease pass through the remaining animals. A lord hoping to restore output on his demesne might find that missing cattle translated into slower ploughing and weaker yields. A dairy shortfall meant less nourishment at exactly the moment bodies most needed recovery. Famine had already stolen strength from people. Pestilence then stole strength from the beasts that worked beside them. This is why the Great Famine matters as more than a tragic interlude before the Black Death. It marked the end of the long medieval expansion that had filled more land with more people over previous centuries. Some historians and reference works describe 1315 to 1317 as the clear break, after which the old growth pattern no longer held. Urban development slowed, agrarian revenues came under strain, and a Europe that had seemed crowded with life now had to reckon with contraction. When later disasters arrived, they struck a society that had already been warned and already weakened by famine. The body remembered that warning first. A person who had gone hungry for years did not instantly recover the moment bread became more available. Malnutrition leaves behind frailty, and frailty reshapes what later disease can do. Modern scholarship on later medieval mortality has suggested that pre-existing stress and weakness mattered enormously when epidemic disease struck. Some recent historians explicitly connect the Great Famine, later livestock losses, and declining living standards to a population made more vulnerable in the decades before the plague. The famine did not cause the Black Death, but it helped prepare a more brittle human landscape for the shocks that followed, and yet daily life, stubborn as ever, had to continue. The oven still needed lighting. Ale still had to be brewed, though governments during the famine had even tried to restrict the use of barley for brewing in order to divert grain back toward food. Fields still had to be harrowed. Debt still had to be discussed in voices that tried to remain calm. Children still had to be taught, unless watched, corrected, fed, and sent to sleep. One of the most moving truths about medieval survival is that it was built not from grand turning points, but from repeated obedience to routine under conditions that had made routine almost unbearable. Perhaps this is why the Great Famine feels so intimate even now. It invites us into no palace certainty. It offers no technological rescue, no administrative system capable of lifting the burden cleanly, no reliable surplus waiting somewhere just beyond the horizon. Instead, it shows a continent full of households trying to keep one more fire burning, one more child alive, one more acre under seed, one more animal through the winter. The scale is vast, but the experience is always local. Hunger arrives house by house. Shame arrives face by face. Survival, too, is measured domestically. If you were to walk through one of those villages some years later, you might notice nothing dramatic at first. A dog sleeping in a patch of light, smoke rising straight in calm weather, a woman shaking out a cloth, a boy driving geese. But beneath those ordinary surfaces would lie a new alertness, a learned caution around weather, grain, and promises, a recognition that life could still be lived, perhaps even sweetly at times, but never again with quite the same trust in abundance. Famine had taught people how breakable the ordinary was, and perhaps that is the deepest transformation of all. Not that Europe became hopeless, because it did not. People married, planted, prayed, traded, sang, quarrelled, repaired, and raised children afterward. History rarely ends in pure ruin. But the famine carved a memory into the century, that civilization in its everyday form rests on simple things being available in season. Dry grain, sound animals, passable roads, stable prices, working bodies, moderate weather, and that when those simple things fail together, the grander structures above them begin to look far less grand. By now, the listener can almost feel how close medieval survival always was to household management, to the pot, the bin, the loft, the shed, the field edge, the weather at dawn. And that is where the story naturally turns next. Because to understand the Great Famine completely, you have to descend even further from kingdoms and mortality into the textures of domestic life itself, into what people actually ate, how they stretched it, how homes smelled and sounded under shortage, and how the smallest rituals of the table became acts of endurance. The famine was lived most intimately at the table, not the grand table of a noble hall, laid with trenchers and status, and the comforting noise of servants crossing rush-covered floors, but the smaller table, or bench, or board set on trestles inside an ordinary house. A place where food was not presented so much as negotiated, where the pot determined the mood of the evening, where a loaf could be divided in ways that revealed more about a family's condition than any official record ever could. In much of medieval northern Europe, the basic grammar of eating was simple. Bread, pottage, and ale formed the centre of ordinary diet for many people, especially in England. For poorer households, barley, oats, rye, peas, and beans often entered bread and pottage more than fine wheat did. Oats might also be used for brewing. These were not emergency foods in themselves. They were the everyday architecture of subsistence, the humble but reliable materials from which a household built survival in ordinary years. That matters, because famine rarely replaces normal food with something dramatically different overnight. More often it stretches the familiar until the familiar becomes grim. A household still made bread if it could. It still set a pot over the fire. It still tried to brew or obtain ale when grain allowed. But each of these acts changed under pressure. Flour grew coarser. Better grain disappeared first. The loaf became heavier and less satisfying, not because it was more generous, but because cheaper grains, pulses, or whatever could bulk it out had taken the place of what had once made it pleasant. Pottage, that endlessly adaptable medieval dish, became more important precisely because it could absorb almost anything. A few beans, some onion, scraps of cabbage, perhaps a little fat if fortune had not entirely withdrawn, a handful of grain, herbs from a plot, stale bread softened in liquid. Together they could still become the evening meal. Pottage was not glamorous, but it was mercifully flexible. In years of famine, flexibility was one of the closest things to wealth, and yet there are limits to what flexibility can do. A pot can be stretched only so far before it stops nourishing and starts merely warming the stomach. The difference matters. Warmth creates the sensation of care. Nourishment creates the strength to keep working. In famine years, families often had to settle for the first while longing for the second. A child might go to sleep feeling less empty and still wake weak. An adult might rise from the table having eaten and yet know, from the hollowness still lingering in the limbs, that the meal had bought only a few more hours of usefulness. Hunger during the Great Famine was not always spectacular. Often it was dull, repetitive, and exhausting. You can almost smell the room in those years. Smoke caught in wool and hair because the fire must be kept low and steady, not bright and wasteful. Damp shoes steaming by the hearth. Sour ale in a cup. Wet straw carried in on boots. A pot that has boiled the same kinds of things so often that the air itself seems seasoned by shortage. Medieval houses were already smoky, close, and materially intimate by modern standards. Under famine, the atmosphere must often have felt even denser, not only with labour and weather, but with concentration. Every scrap mattered, every crust, every spoonful left at the bottom of a bowl. Waste became offensive in a new and painful way, because what was wasted might not be replaced. This is why the smallest domestic gestures acquired emotional force. A woman scraping the pot clean before washing it. A child being told to finish every bite, not sternly but with a seriousness beyond ordinary manners. Someone saving crumbs for morning. A heel of bread tucked away, not because it is good, but because it is there. In prosperous ages, ritual around food can be aesthetic. In poor ones, it becomes moral. Medieval households had always been careful in ways that modern abundance has made less necessary. But famine sharpened thrift into discipline. Even the order of eating may have changed. Perhaps the strongest worker first on some nights, because tomorrow's labour required it. Perhaps the smallest children. Perhaps an elderly parent quietly claiming not to be hungry. Survival often appears in history as a structural question. At home, it was frequently a matter of serving order, portion size, and silence. Ale too belonged to this domestic story. For modern listeners, ale can sound like an indulgence. In much of medieval Europe, it was closer to a daily staple, especially when brewed weak, because it provided calories and safer hydration than untreated water could always guarantee. When grain was scarce, however, brewing itself became morally fraught. In 1317, Edward II's government tried to forbid the use of barley in brewing ale, an attempt to push scarce grain back toward bread and direct sustenance. That single policy tells you a great deal about the household crisis. It reveals that food and drink were competing inside the same tight reserve, and that what had once been ordinary domestic production had become part of a national emergency. Imagine what that meant inside a house. A weaker ale, or none. Less comfort after labour. Less liquid nourishment for those who had relied on it, without thinking much about the distinction between drink and food. Brewing was not simply a matter of taste. It belonged to the rhythm of household provision, especially for women who often managed or performed much of that work. Famine disrupted not only what was eaten but the routine by which a home turned grain into life. And when routine is damaged, people feel precarious even before the cupboard is completely bare. There is also the question of bread, and bread deserves its own kind of attention. Bread in medieval life was more than a foodstuff. It was texture, status, expectation, and measure. A better loaf spoke of better grain, better sieving, better fortune. A rougher loaf told another story. During the Great Famine, grain prices in England surged dramatically after the failed harvests, and poorer households were forced ever further down the ladder of quality and quantity. What had once been an unremarkable daily presence became uncertain and expensive enough to unsettle the emotional balance of a day. If bread could not be trusted, little else could. That uncertainty changed the feeling of baking itself. To bake in scarcity is to put precious material briefly at risk in the oven. Will the dough rise enough? Will the grain prove worse than expected? Has too much of the reserve been used on a loaf that must now last longer than it should? Even the smell of bread, usually one of the great consolations of domestic life, could become almost unbearable when the resulting loaf had to be rationed so tightly that pleasure was forbidden. A warm loaf invites appetite. Famine teaches restraint. The conflict between those two truths must have been felt with particular sharpness by the people cutting and distributing it. And then there were the substitutes, the extenders, the last resorts. When dearth deepened, people did what hungry societies have always done. They widened the boundary of what could count as food. Contemporary and later accounts of the Great Famine describe people gathering wild roots, grasses, nuts, and even bark from the forests, not as culinary novelty but as a form of reluctant improvisation. Here the distance between normal subsistence and desperation becomes painfully clear. A society that has moved from bread grain to roots and bark has not merely tightened its diet. It has begun eating the margins of the landscape, yet even these last resorts had their own domestic logic. Someone had to identify what could be gathered. Someone had to walk out in bad weather to collect it. Someone had to clean it, pound it, boil it, strain bitterness from it if possible, and persuade the household to swallow what came back. Famine labour is often invisible because it produces so little obvious success. A woman can spend hours turning poor ingredients into a meal that barely sustains anyone, and history may record nothing except continued scarcity. But this labour, patient, repetitive, low status and exhausting, was one of the things that kept Europe alive through those years. The hearth therefore became both centre and witness. At the hearth, shortages were made practical. Grain was measured there. Water was added there. Bones were boiled again there. Wet clothes dried there. Children were warmed there when food could not warm them enough from within. The hearth, perhaps more than the field, was where famine's emotional reality became visible each evening. In the field one could still hope. At the hearth one had to divide what actually existed, and division is where love, hierarchy and fear all meet. Who gets the thicker slice? Who is told there is no more? Who pretends satisfaction? Who drinks the last of the ale? Who receives a bit of animal fat saved from better days? Who is considered too young to understand, and who is old enough to endure disappointment quietly? Medieval households were not egalitarian spaces. They were shaped by age, gender, labour value, and authority. Famine did not erase those patterns. It sharpened them, but it also exposed tenderness within them. A parent eating less, a sibling sharing without ceremony, a grandparent withdrawing from the table before the bowl is quite finished. These are the gestures that rarely survive in documents, and yet belong unmistakably to the truth of scarcity. There would also have been fatigue around cooking itself. Modern people often imagine hunger as simple absence. In reality, managing hunger can be incredibly time-consuming. To find substitute foods, to queue or walk for grain, to borrow, to stretch, to boil, to dry, to guard stores, to scrape vessels clean, to cook foods that are poorer and slower and less satisfying. These tasks multiply when food quality falls. Famine does not only empty the pot, it makes the preparation of that pot more burdensome. And because much of medieval household food work was women's work, a substantial share of this extra burden fell onto shoulders already carrying children, fuel, water, cleaning, spinning, mending, and the emotional work of steadying a frightened home. This is where the romantic image of medieval domesticity finally collapses. There is nothing picturesque in watching the same stew made thinner week after week. Nothing charming in the smell of damp fuel because better fuel has run out. Nothing quaint in bread cut with worry. The Great Famine reminds us that the medieval household, however rich in ritual and familiarity, was also a site of relentless material calculation. It could be tender, but tenderness itself required resources, and when resources shrank, love had to express itself through management, self-denial, and the refusal to waste. Even table prayer in such a setting would have changed its tone. The words may have remained familiar: the blessing over bread, the thanks for what had been given, the request for mercy, the crossing of oneself before eating. But words spoken over a full loaf and words spoken over a thin one are not experienced in the same way. A blessing in famine does not float above circumstance. It presses against it. It can become more fervent, more desperate, more dutiful, or quietly more wounded. Yet people kept speaking those words because ritual, like pottage, could stretch when much else could not. It gave shape to evenings that might otherwise have dissolved into pure fear. By the end of the worst years then, survival had become a domestic art of reduction. Reduce the loaf, reduce the ale, reduce the fire, reduce the meal, reduce the self. Keep enough back for seed if you can. Keep enough warmth in the room that the weak do not fail in the night. Keep enough order at the table that children do not panic. Keep enough dignity in the routine that hunger does not devour the household before starvation does. There is something profoundly moving in that effort. Not grand, not heroic in the theatrical sense, but stubbornly human. And once you have seen famine at the table, the next place your attention naturally goes is beyond the house again, but not to kings or proclamations, to the landscape immediately around the house, the garden plot, the common, the hedgerow, the marsh edge, the forest path, because when the pot grew too light, Europe's hungry had to search the living margins of the world itself. When the pot grew thin, people turned outward, not toward kings or miracles, at least not first, but toward the land nearest the house, the strip behind the cottage, the damp edge of a common, the hedge that marked one holding from another, the scrubby patch where pigs once rooted, the woodland path known since childhood, the bank of a stream, the marshy ground that stained shoes and hems but sometimes offered something edible in return. In ordinary years, these places supplemented life. In famine years, they became part of the difference between weakness and immediate collapse. This is one of the great truths hidden inside medieval rural life. Survival did not depend only on the neatly ploughed field. It also depended on access to margins. Modern people often imagine land in rigid categories: owned, fenced, measured, closed. Medieval landscapes could be more layered than that, especially for the poor. Rights to graze, gather wood, cut turf, glean, fish, or collect other small necessities were often embedded in custom and local practice, even if they were contested and unevenly distributed. Recent scholarship on medieval commons emphasizes that these shared resource systems were not decorative leftovers from a simpler world. They were part of how peasant households buffered shocks, spread risk, and survived uncertainty. When harvests failed, those margins mattered even more. So imagine a woman stepping out after dawn not with a basket for market, but with a smaller, humbler intention. She's not going to buy. She's going to look. She knows where nettles grow first in the season. She knows which roots can be taken without poisoning the pot, which herbs can sharpen a thin broth, which patches of woodland have yielded nuts in better years, which paths lead to places where fallen branches might still be gathered, if no steward or neighbour objects. Knowledge like this rarely appears in royal records, but it was one of the quiet forms of wealth famine revealed. A household without stored grain might still possess memory of where to find, when to cut, what to boil twice, what bitterness can be washed away, what cannot. In hard times, memory itself becomes a tool. The forest took on a different moral shape in those years. In comfortable imagination, woodland can seem almost generous. Berries in season, nuts in the leaf fall, mushrooms under damp shade, branches for the fire. But during the Great Famine, the forest was not a place of leisure. It was a place where people went when ordinary agriculture had failed them. Contemporary descriptions of the famine explicitly mention the gathering of wild roots, grasses, nuts, and bark from forests as hunger deepened. That list is sobering because it marks a descent down the ladder of food quality and social dignity. A society living on grain is one thing. A society stripping bark and digging roots in quantity is another, and even then, the forest did not simply give. Someone had to know where to search and how to prepare what was found. Bark is not bread. Roots are not wheat. Wild foods can demand labour, judgment, and patience, out of all proportion to the nourishment they finally provide. They must be carried home wet and dirty, cleaned, chopped, pounded, boiled, or mixed into something else before they can be swallowed with any hope of use. Famine foraging is often imagined as a swift, desperate act, but much of it must have been slow and repetitive with meagre returns. Hours spent searching the margins could produce a meal that still left the household weak. Then there were hedgerows and field edges, the thin seams between one person's labour and another's rights. In a better harvest, gleaning could offer the poor a final chance to gather scattered ears of grain missed during reaping. It was never a replacement for having land of one's own, but it could matter. Medieval and later manorial evidence suggests that gleaning was often associated with the poorer and more vulnerable. Paupers, hired workers, women, children, those living close to the edge even in ordinary seasons. But the cruel irony of famine is that failed harvests reduce not only the main crop, but the leftovers. A field badly yielding has less to glean. A community full of hungry people has more eyes on every fallen ear. What had once been a modest customary help could become another site of tension. You can feel the pressure inside such a scene. A woman stooping after the reapers, moving quickly because others are behind her. A child helping with chilled fingers, dropping kernels into a small cloth or basket. A landholder watching too closely, fearing encroachment. Another poor family arriving from the next lane over, late, apologetic, already unwelcome because there is not enough left for one household, let alone two. Famine has a way of turning customary kindnesses into contested privileges. People do not stop recognizing mercy as good. They simply begin pricing it against their own need. The commons, likewise, were not magical reservoirs of plenty. They were under pressure because everyone understood their value. Shared pasture, rough grazing, woodland access, peat-cutting grounds, marsh edges and other collectively used spaces could help peasant societies absorb shocks, but they worked best when the strain was bearable and the rules still held. Under extreme stress, commons could become battlegrounds of custom. Who had the right to gather? How much wood counted as need rather than theft? Could extra pigs be turned out if fodder was short? Could strangers use local resources if they were kin, or if they had nowhere else to go? Scholarship on medieval commons repeatedly emphasizes this double truth. They could make survival more resilient, but only within institutions of trust and enforcement that crises themselves could weaken. Fuel mattered almost as much as food. A modern person can underestimate this because heat is so easily summoned now. In a medieval household, fuel was labour stored in physical form. Fire cooked the pottage, baked the bread, heated the ale, dried the clothes, warmed the weak, and made damp houses inhabitable through cold nights. If food was thinner, and warmth became more important, not less. A hungry body feels cold sharply, so when people gathered fallen wood, brush, peat, turf, or whatever their local landscape allowed, they were not just preserving comfort. They were preserving the conditions under which poor food could at least be made warm, and a household could stay alive long enough to face morning again. A small bundle of sticks, then, could carry astonishing emotional weight. Too little fuel meant meals delayed or undercooked, wet garments never drying properly, infants and elderly people cooling too far at night. Smoke from poor green wood thickening the room and stinging the eyes because better fuel had already been burned. The same rain that ruined grain also complicated the business of keeping dry firewood. Everywhere the crisis seemed to touch one necessity through another. Waterways offered another margin, though never an effortless one. Fish had an important place in medieval diets generally, and customary access to fisheries could matter greatly to local communities. Peasants in many regions defended long-standing uses of rivers, ponds and other waters as what historians now describe as fisheries commons. Fishing required knowledge, gear, time, and access, and it did not belong equally to everyone. But in hard years, the possibility of taking fish, eels, or other small aquatic food from nearby waters could become precious. It was another way the edges of the managed landscape helped support life when the core had failed. Even here, though, famine sharpened inequality. A lord's fish pond, a monastery's rights, a well-guarded stretch of water, a mill stream under close supervision. These were not simply open gifts to the desperate. Medieval resources were layered with ownership and hierarchy. A hungry peasant looking at a pond full of fish might still be looking at a forbidden world. Need did not dissolve rights. Often it made them harder, which means that part of surviving famine was navigating not only nature, but permission. Near the house itself, the garden plot took on new importance. For ordinary people, gardens were not luxuries. They could provide onions, leeks, cabbage, peas, beans, herbs, and other small supports to the diet. Research on medieval peasant diet increasingly underscores how much these humble plant foods mattered beside grain, pottage, and occasional animal products. In famine years, whatever still grew near the house could spare a family some precious grain, or at least flavour the pot enough to make thin food bearable. A few leeks, a handful of cabbage, some beans properly dried and rationed. These are not dramatic things, but they belong to the real texture of survival. The garden also had one advantage the wider landscape did not: intimacy. A woman could look at a patch and know exactly what had failed there and what had not. She could judge what might be picked green, what had to be left, what could be saved for seed, what would not amount to enough unless combined with something else. In famine, control over even a very small patch of produce could feel like a form of dignity. It was not much, perhaps, but it belonged to the household's own effort and judgment. After months of market prices, debts, refusals, and uncertainty, that kind of control had emotional value beyond its calories, and yet the household could not live from margins alone. That is what makes this search of the landscape so moving and so sad. It reveals both ingenuity and its limits. Medieval people were not passive victims waiting for bread from above. They searched, gathered, trapped, gleaned, bargained, brewed less, stretched more, and turned every local resource they could into sustenance. But the very breadth of those strategies shows how severe the pressure had become. When a family is cutting deeper into commons, taking more from hedgerows, probing the woods, watching streams, protecting scraps from the garden, and still remaining hungry, it means the ordinary agricultural order has failed at its centre. The children would have learned this fastest. Not in words, but in roots. Which path leads to kindling? Which ditch edge yields something green? Which tree drops nuts? Which field may be gleaned after harvest and which may not? Which pond is watched? Which household shares? Which dog bites? Childhood in any era is partly an education in landscape, but famine makes that education harsher. It teaches young people that the world around them is not scenery. It is a map of need. There is a particular tenderness in imagining that map. A parent taking a child out not for pleasure, but to teach the difference between what can be eaten and what must be left alone. Noticing how thin the child's wrists are while explaining it. Keeping the voice calm so the lesson feels like ordinary knowledge instead of an admission that the household is frightened. Much of medieval survival must have looked like this, love taking the form of instruction, and there was risk in every outing. Wet ground, long walks, territorial disputes, accusations of trespass, illness caught in bad weather, time lost from other labour, and the simple possibility of returning home with almost nothing. Foraging and gleaning sound from a distance, like action. In practice, they could also be evidence that better options were gone. A woman who spent half a day searching the margins and came back with too little was not only tired. She was carrying disappointment into a room already full of it. Still, people kept going out. That may be the most human part of the famine story. Not the proclamations or the mortality estimates, important as those are, but the repeated choice to search one more field edge. One more patch of wood, one more stream bank, one more common path. Medieval people survived not because the landscape was kind, but because they knew how to read small opportunities inside an unkind year, and because they did not stop reading them when they were tired. By now the famine has taken us from field to table to forest path, from kings and markets back down to damp earth under ordinary shoes, and there is one final layer still waiting. Because after the weather, the hunger, the theft, the weakened bodies, the stretched households, and the stripped margins of the land, what remains is the inner world the famine left behind, its memory, its warning, and the quiet way it changed how people understood security, providence, and the ordinary miracle of enough. What the famine left behind was not only emptiness, but memory. But not memory in the neat sense of a date entered into a chronicle, though chroniclers did write of those years with dread. Something deeper than that. A memory stored in behaviour, in the speed with which bread was wrapped and put away, in the way a dark summer cloud could still pull eyes upward, even after the harvest had steadied, in the habit of saving a little more than seemed strictly necessary because necessity, people had learned, could expand without warning. The Great Famine did not vanish when the rain eased. In many regions, recovery was slow enough that Europe was not fully back on stable footing until the early 1320s, and that long aftermath gave the disaster time to sink into the culture of ordinary caution. A catastrophe becomes part of a society when it changes what people think is normal. Before 1315, medieval Europeans were hardly strangers to scarcity. Crop failures, local dearth, and bad weather belonged to the known world. But the Great Famine taught a harsher lesson than local shortage ever could. It showed that large regions could fail together, that bad weather could persist beyond one season's patience, and that the usual social structures — lords, markets, kings, monasteries, parish life — could cushion suffering only so far. For many, that would have felt like a revelation of fragility. The familiar world had not ended, but it had proved far less secure than it looked. Chroniclers remembered the years in terms of dread, mortality, and prolonged disorder, and modern historians often treat the famine as a decisive break in the long period of medieval expansion that had preceded it. There is a particular sadness in the fact that memory like this is rarely dramatic. A battle leaves a field, a plague leaves sudden silence, famine leaves habits, the old woman who insists nothing be wasted, the tenant who no longer trusts a promising season until the grain is dry and stored, the parent who teaches children where the edible margins of the landscape lie, not because that knowledge is charming, but because once it was necessary. No clerk would have written these things down, yet they may be among the truest legacies of all. A society that has eaten its seed grain, searched its woods for bark and roots, watched its animals fail, and seen bread priced beyond reach does not return to innocence. It returns to work, yes, and to prayer, and to markets, and to weddings, and to ordinary quarrels. But underneath all that, and something has shifted. Security now feels conditional. That shift mattered not only in the household, but in the moral imagination of Europe. Medieval men and women did not inhabit a spiritually empty universe. They understood calamity through God, sin, providence, punishment, mercy, and trial. The sky was not merely weather, it was meaning. And during the famine years, people prayed through a disaster that did not quickly yield to prayer. That did not mean faith collapsed. Far from it. Most people remained within the religious world that gave shape to their lives. But later writers and historians have noted that the famine exposed the limits of institutional reassurance. The church could explain, exhort, bless, and distribute charity where it could. It could not stop the rain, refill the bins, or prevent bodies weakened by hunger from succumbing to disease. Some historians argue that this helped undermine confidence in established authority, including ecclesiastical authority, by making its practical limitations painfully visible. That kind of disappointment is often quiet. A person still attends Mass, still kneels, still says grace over bread, still appeals to saints in fear or gratitude. But perhaps the tone changes. There may be more urgency in it, or more ache. Faith after famine can remain real and still be bruised. The same prayer spoken before 1315 and after 1317 would not necessarily feel the same in the mouth. Before, it may have been woven into ordinary dependence. After, it might carry the memory of unanswered nights, of fields watched in vain, of children weakened despite all devotion. This is not unbelief. It is belief altered by experience. The same can be said of politics, though in a rougher key. Kings and governments were not absent during the Great Famine. Edward II's government, for instance, issued measures against grain export, encouraged imports, and even tried to restrict the use of barley in brewing so that grain could be directed back toward food. Those steps reveal that authorities recognized the emergency. Yet recognition is not rescue. The state could regulate, inspect, proclaim, threaten, and exhort, but it could not conjure abundance into a wet and failing agricultural system. Modern historians often point to the famine as a moment when the weakness of medieval governmental capacity was laid bare. The limits of power had always existed, of course, but in crisis they became impossible to ignore. That, too, would have lingered in memory, not perhaps as abstract constitutional thinking, but as a simpler and older conclusion. Those above you may command much, yet still fail to keep bread affordable or harvests secure. For peasants, labourers, and the urban poor, the famine could have sharpened a practical skepticism toward promises from above. People still depended on authority. They had no choice. But dependence and trust are not the same thing. A community can continue submitting to power while privately revising its estimate of what that power is actually worth in a real emergency. And the memory of the body remained strongest of all. Many died during the famine itself or from the disease that followed in its wake. Broad estimates vary, but historians commonly place mortality in some affected regions around 10 to 15%, sometimes more. Those who lived did not all emerge whole. Prolonged hunger reduces strength, lowers resistance to illness, complicates pregnancy and child rearing, and leaves behind frailty that can shadow later years. Even after the famine's worst phase ended, later livestock disease and continuing hardship slowed recovery further. This meant that Europe entered the following decades not refreshed but thinned. Bodies had been tested, and many had been permanently diminished by the test. There is a cruel intimacy to that kind of aftermath. A man survives, but his strength never quite returns. A woman keeps her children alive, but ages more quickly in the process. A child lives through the crisis, yet carries forward into adulthood a body shaped by years of poor nourishment. History does not always announce these losses with drama. Often they sit inside the ordinary, a slower gait, a smaller appetite that is not health, but caution, a cough that lingers longer than it should. The famine altered Europe not only by taking lives, but by changing the condition of the surviving lives it left behind. That helps explain why the Great Famine matters so much in the story of the 14th century. It was not the Black Death, and it should not be blurred into that later catastrophe. But it did mark the end of an era. The great centuries of population growth and land expansion that had filled much of medieval Europe with settlement and agricultural intensity were brought to a stop. The famine stands as the first of the major crises that would define the century, and later disasters would strike a Europe already acquainted with ecological failure, already familiar with mass hardship, and in some ways already weakened by it. Historians often describe the famine as a turning point precisely because it ended that older confidence in continuing growth, and yet ordinary life, stubborn and intimate as ever, persisted. This may be the most moving fact of all. The fields were still sown, the ovens were still heated when there was grain enough, children were still corrected for snatching food too soon, lovers still met, priests still preached, merchants still argued over measures and weights, roofs were still patched, shoes were still mended. If the famine left a warning in Europe, it also left an example of how human beings continue under wounded conditions. They do not wait for the world to become trustworthy before resuming life. They resume life while mistrusting it. So the famine's memory became double. On one side it was caution, save more, trust less, notice the weather, fear the failure of grain, keep what reserves you can. On the other, it was endurance. No matter how uncertain the future, the pot must still be set on the fire, the child still washed, the field still prepared, the prayer still spoken, the bread still cut as justly as possible. Memory, in that sense, did not merely frighten, it instructed. You can feel this especially if you imagine an old person many years later, perhaps in the 1330s or 1340s, looking at a good harvest with a face younger people find unreadable. To them, plenty is simply plenty. To that older survivor, it is also reprieve. The grain in the loft is not only grain. It is the absence of 1315, the relief of not repeating 1316. The fragile promise that this winter may not be one of those winters. Every society contains memories that younger people inherit only partially. The Great Famine must have been one of those memories, fully understood only by those who had watched the rain continue long after hope had become unreasonable. That older generation would have known too how swiftly a civilization's confidence could be humbled. Not its palaces, its banners, or its language of divine order, but its daily confidence. The confidence that enough food would exist for most people to remain decent, obedient and broadly functional. The confidence that markets would remain markets and not become scenes of accusation. The confidence that households could absorb one more poor season. The confidence that prayer, power, and custom together formed a sturdy roof over ordinary life. The Great Famine had shown how thin that roof could become, and perhaps that is why the story still feels so near to us now. Because beneath the medieval details, the thatch, the pottage, the manorial dues, the wet wool, the parish bells, lies something painfully familiar. Human beings depending on systems they barely control. Human beings learning too late how little margin those systems contained. Human beings carrying trauma not as spectacle, but as caution built into daily habit. The Great Famine belongs to medieval history, but it also belongs to the timeless history of what happens when ordinary life is forced to understand its own fragility. By now, the world of the famine is almost complete around us. The rain, the fields, the markets, the weakened bodies, the strained laws, the thin household meals, the searched margins of forest and common, and the memory that outlived them all. There is only one final step left, to draw these threads together and rest, for a moment, beside the larger human truth the famine reveals about dependence, endurance, and the cost of living too near the edge. In the end, the Great Famine leaves you with a humbling thought. Not that medieval Europe was weak exactly. It had endured bad weather before. It had survived war, poor harvests, local hunger, political disorder, and all the ordinary roughness of pre-modern life. What the famine revealed was something more unsettling than weakness. It revealed how much of civilization depends on a chain of ordinary things continuing to happen on time. Rain falling in season and then stopping. Grain ripening. Hay drying. The animals living through winter. Seed remaining seed and not becoming supper. Bread staying within reach of the hands that need it most. When too many of those ordinary things fail together, even a society full of law, prayer, custom, rank and labour can find itself frighteningly exposed. That is why the Great Famine matters so much beyond its dates. The crisis began with the sodden seasons of 1315, intensified through 1316, and eased only slowly after 1317, with recovery in some places dragging into the early 1320s. Modern climate work has shown that these were exceptionally wet years by long historical standards, and historians widely regard the famine as one of the great turning points of medieval Europe, marking the end of the long era of expansion that had preceded it. But history at this scale is still lived privately. It is lived by a woman lifting the lid of a pot, and already knowing from the smell and the weight of the steam that there will not be enough. By a man looking at a patch of field and trying to decide whether hope still counts as good judgment. By a child learning too early that bread can be measured in silence. By an old person pretending satiety because someone younger still has tomorrow's labour ahead of them. These are not the details most records preserve, yet they are the real architecture of the event. Kingdoms suffered, yes. Markets strained. Authorities issued orders. Chroniclers searched for language strong enough to match the horror. But the famine itself entered history through rooms, bowls, paths, bodies and weather. And perhaps that is why it remains so haunting. The Great Famine does not offer the sharp, a terrible drama of a sudden invasion or a plague that sweeps through in weeks. It is slower than that, wetter than that, quieter in its early stages. It arrives first as inconvenience, then anxiety, then arithmetic, and only later as catastrophe. One more ruined harvest, one more rise in price, one more animal lost, one more seed sack opened too soon, one more day of searching the hedgerow or the woods for something the household can boil into survival. The disaster does not begin when people start dying. It begins when ordinary precautions stop being enough. That is a deeply human pattern, and not only a medieval one. We like to imagine collapse as dramatic because drama is easier to recognize, but many real disasters enter life gradually, by reducing margin. They do not always shatter a world at once. They thin it. They take away comfort first, then confidence, then reserve. They ask people to improvise, then to sacrifice, then to consume the future in order to remain present. Medieval Europeans knew this with brutal intimacy during the famine years. They lived through the moment when adaptation became depletion, and depletion became a new normal. If you listen closely, the whole story has really been about enough. Enough grain left to sow, enough hay dried to keep the ox alive, enough strength in the body to work one more day, enough trust in neighbours to borrow, enough mercy in a lord to delay payment, enough room in a monastery's charity for one more stranger at the gate, enough firewood gathered to keep thin food warm through the evening, enough dignity preserved at the table that the family does not fall apart before the body does. Famine is what happens when a society built on narrow margins discovers that margin is not, in fact, enough. And still, One of the quietest truths of the Great Famine is that people continued to make a world inside it. Not a beautiful world, not a secure one, not a world anyone would willingly choose, but a world nonetheless. They still baked when there was flour, still mended clothing, still gathered fuel, still argued, bargained, worked, prayed, married, gave birth, buried their dead, and tried to preserve some recognizable pattern of life inside conditions that had made pattern hard to maintain. That effort matters. It is tempting to reserve admiration for dramatic acts, for battles won, for rulers who issue decrees, for saints and heroes and famous survivors. Yet some of the greatest endurance in history is quieter than that. It is a woman thinning pottage without letting fear enter her voice. It is a father rising weak and going back to the field because the field, however poor, remains the only future the family has. It is a child carrying kindling in the rain. It is the unrecorded mercy of one hungry person sharing with another. The records we possess can only hint at how much of this went unseen. We know the famine struck much of northern Europe. We know the weather was exceptionally hostile. We know grain prices surged, markets strained, theft increased, bodies weakened, and mortality rose sharply, with modern estimates often placing deaths in the broad range of roughly 1/10 to 1/7 of the population in some affected regions. We also know recovery was slowed by lingering weakness and later livestock disease, especially the great cattle pestilence of 1319 to 1321. Those are large truths and they matter, but no estimate can fully contain the private cost of those years, because the private cost was measured in altered habits. It was measured in people becoming careful in ways they had not needed to be before, in the new emotional weight of a full bin, in the suspicious glance cast at a wet summer, in the habit of saving and hiding and counting, in the way a community remembered who had shared and who had not, in the way prayer sounded after years in which prayer had not been followed quickly by relief, in the way children were taught the landscape around them, not as scenery, but as reserve, as warning, as a map of what might still be found if the centre failed again. That may be the famine's deepest legacy. It trained people to see dependence more clearly. Before the crisis, dependence had already been the truth of medieval life, but it could often pass unnoticed because it was ordinary. People depended on weather, soil, animals, labour, custom, trade, and one another every day. The famine stripped away the comfort of not noticing. It forced the whole chain into view. A ruined field became a weak animal became a poorer ploughing became worse sowing became a thinner harvest became debt and sale and hunger became illness became absence, and absence became a changed village. Cause and consequence no longer sat far apart. They lived together in the same wet morning. And because the crisis unfolded inside a deeply religious society, it also revealed another kind of dependence, the dependence people felt on meaning itself. A world in which disaster can be understood as divine punishment, divine testing, or divine mystery is not a world without explanation. But explanation is not the same as relief. One of the most painful tensions of the famine years was that the usual spiritual forms remained available, while the material crisis persisted. People could still pray, process, fast, confess, and seek mercy, but those acts did not stop the rain. Later writers and historians have often suggested that this experience helped expose the practical limits of both church and state. They did not cease to matter, but they proved unable to command the essentials of life back into place. There is no neat moral to this. The famine does not reward virtue reliably enough for that. Good people suffered. Hard people sometimes survived. Institutions tried and failed. Households made impossible choices. Some shared, some hoarded, some endured with dignity, some broke. What history offers here is not a lesson in moral simplicity, but a sharper view of the conditions under which decency becomes difficult. Hunger does not automatically ennoble or corrupt. It tests, it narrows, it reveals, and what it reveals is often painfully mixed. Yet if there is a kind of wisdom here, it lies in the ordinary scale of the story. The Great Famine was not finally about kings, though kings were caught inside it. It was not finally about chronicles, though chroniclers gave it words. It was not finally even about weather, though weather began it. It was about the small human systems that make life livable: the household, the field, the common, the market, the parish, the bargain, the meal. When we think of history only at the level of empires and events, we miss the fragile machinery underneath. Famine forces our eyes downward, toward the simple things without which no civilization remains civilized for long. Perhaps that is why the opening sound of this story still feels like the truest one. Rain on thatch, rain on shutters, rain soaking ground that should have dried by now. A woman at a doorway, looking up and trying to decide whether this is still weather or already the beginning of something worse. In that moment, history is not announcing itself. It is only arriving, quietly, repetitively, with the confidence of a season that does not know it is about to be remembered for centuries. And that may be the last thing worth carrying from these years into sleep, that most people in the Great Famine were not heroes in the storybook sense. They were ordinary people asked to do extraordinary amounts of enduring, to divide too little fairly, to keep children warm when food ran low, to search the margins of the land with tired hands, to rise into another wet dawn and continue. Their lives were local, mostly anonymous, and often unrecorded except where suffering brushed against a monastery, a court, or a royal household. Yet they were the true substance of the event. The famine happened through them, and Europe survived through them too. So when the century turned darker in the years that followed, as it would, the memory of 1315 to 1317 remained beneath the surface of life like water under soil, a warning, a wound, a discipline, a reminder that enough should never be taken for granted, that bread is never only bread, that security is often just a sequence of ordinary successes we have stopped noticing, and that the history of survival, when told honestly, belongs less to monuments than to kitchens, muddy paths, and the patient human art of making one more day possible.